Please be seated. My husband ordered as a gift for me a copy of Go Set a Watchman even before its July 14th publication date. Not surprisingly, Harper Lee's so-called sequel to her Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece, To Kill a Mockingbird, sold over 1 million copies in its first week. It has been called an historic literary event by some, an epic money grab by others. One New York Times blogger called it perhaps the most important novel on race to come out of the white South in decades. The general consensus is that Watchmen, whatever else might be said of it, is only mediocre when placed alongside Mockingbird. And how could it be otherwise? Nevertheless, I read the whole thing in short order, mainly because I couldn't help myself. The plot line is thin. An adult scout who has dropped her nickname and now goes by Jean Louise comes home from New York City to Macomb, Alabama. She is shocked to discover a racist track in her father's papers and determines to find out what is going on. She goes to the courthouse where a meeting of the Citizens Council is underway. And from the same balcony where in Mockingbird she watched her father defend a black man, she witnesses Atticus align himself with staunch segregationist. She is so horrified that she becomes physically sick. I have loved Scout Finch since I was a kid. And Atticus reminded me so much of my own father that I unabashedly confused the two in my mind and heart. I can tell you without spoiling anything that the grown-up Jean Louise is not nearly so winsome as the 6-year-old Scout. And Atticus does indeed come across as a man we hardly recognize. As one reviewer put it, if even Atticus Finch turns out to be a racist, then what? It is a question worth asking, not only because racial conflict in this country refuses to go away, but because it exposes a human dilemma that confounds our deep and persistent longings for perfection. What do we do when the people we count on disappoint us? When our heroes fail to live up to our fantasies of how we imagine them to be? What happens when all we believe to be true falls apart right in front of our eyes? The Old Testament lesson for today unfolds at a pivotal moment in the long saga of one of the Bible's most revered heroes. It is the R-rated tale of a middle-aged David and a beautiful woman who is the wife of another man. Of course, other parts of the David story are much more familiar. David the shepherd boy chosen by God, David the victor over Goliath, David the courageous warrior, David the musician and poet, David, founder of the dynasty through whom the Messiah will come. Today's story is less familiar and anything but inspiring. In fact, it seems like we are reading about a completely different man. The action in this melodrama begins in the spring. at, quote, the time when kings go out to battle. So the first question we might ask is, what was King David doing back in Jerusalem? Clearly, he no longer felt obliged to participate in the dangerous and unpleasant activities of battle. Maybe he had gotten tired of the hardships involved, or had lost interest in the conflicts that drove men to make war in the first place. Maybe on this particular day, bereft of his usual amusements or distractions, he had become restless and bored. In any case, David sees Bathsheba bathing on a roof, and he sends a messenger to inquire about her. Never mind that by this point in the story, David already has 6 wives. He sends for her, and then the text says he takes her or lays with her. There is no indication that David and Bathsheba had ever met before, although they surely could have. Neither are we given a single clue as to how she felt about the king's summons. Some commentators suggest that Bathsheba actually wanted to be seen, that she was an opportunist who seized the moment while her husband was away to advance her own ambitions. She has, in fact, been labeled throughout the centuries as one of the Bible's bad girls. But if you read the text, you will find not one shred of evidence to support that view. What we do know is that as a woman, she lacked any kind of power to refuse the king. And so she went. Had the story ended here, we could call it a king's indulgence, and while not a pretty story, it's one we've heard before. But in due time, Bathsheba sends word that she is pregnant, and the king, with no thought for how his actions will impact her, sets in motion a series of events that will have catastrophic consequences. First, he plots a cover-up. Get Bathsheba's husband Uriah off the battlefield and reunited with his wife so that the baby can be passed off as his. But here, David miscalculates. Uriah is not only a loyal soldier, but a man of honor, and so despite the king's urgings, he refuses to accept privileges denied to his men. Not just once, but twice. We can imagine a frustrated, perhaps even desperate David, seemingly left with no choice but to get rid of his uncooperative foil. And so he sends Uriah back to the front with a letter to be opened by the general. The letter says, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die." In this final act of malice, the last sentence of our text, David has Uriah deliver his own death sentence. Sexual exploitation of Bathsheba, duplicitous scheming to save his own skin, and the murder of a righteous man. Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann calls this sorry episode, quote, a most ruthless political performance. Innocence, he goes on to say, is never to be retrieved. From now on, the life of David is marked, and all Israel must live with that mark. And so we come back around to our original question. If even Atticus Finch, arguably the most beloved literary hero ever, if even he turns out to be a racist, then what? If even David, the darling of the Hebrew Scriptures, turns out to be a self-centered tyrant, what hope is there? We can't get away with an easy reassurance that God loves them and us anyway, no matter what we do, even though that is our claim as a people who put our trust in a loving and forgiving God. But to leave it at that would be cheap grace that asks nothing of us. A more fruitful path, I believe, a more mature path, perhaps, would be to read these two cautionary tales, one ancient, one modern, as invitations to look deeply into our own hearts. Not to heap shame or blame on an already conflicted conscience, but as an opportunity to come clean about who we really are behind the facade. Next week's Old Testament lesson is a continuation of this one. In it, David will finally be confronted with the damage he has done. He will hear the damning words from the prophet Nathan, "You are the man." And so it is, I suggest, for all of us. We are the man. We are the woman. We are the ones who, through our ignorance and selfishness, have contributed to the most distressing problems of our time. We, not someone else, are the ones who have failed to love deeply and well. Not because we are bad people. Please don't hear me say that. Not because we are bad people, but because we are, every one of us, flawed human beings who will never, if we live to be 150, we will never achieve the perfection we long for and strive for. As Christians, we look to Jesus, the God-man, to show us how to live in the world as just and loving human beings. If I am reading his life rightly, I see a man who did not ever misuse the considerable power he had been given. He did not coerce, manipulate, deceive, or use privilege to make others small. In fact, his way of being in the world was to divest himself of privilege again and again. And he preached to those who would follow him to do likewise. As Jesus followers, we are called to a path that is not easy. And yes, we will be disappointed again and again. And yes, most of us will disappoint those who look up to us. Our call is not to despair, but to learn from our failures and keep our eyes cast on Jesus, who saves us from ourselves. And to remember that whatever baby steps we manage in this life, we take them not on our own, but with God's help and with each other's love and support. And that, it seems to me, is very good news.